Greetings and salutations, everybody. Welcome back to yet another episode of the Snarp Fangle Podcast. I'm your host, Jake Metzger, along with a man who needs no introduction, but we'll give him one anyway. He's the tangler of the trades, the folder of magic, the agitator of guitar strings, and proof of a failed assassination attempt. Our wonderful host, David Reed. David, how are you doing?
I'm doing just fine.
Just fine. Nothing new of notoriety?
No.
All right. Well, with that, let's move on to our other co-host for the evening. You might recognize her, but here we go. If you are not familiar, she is the woman who is probably would have been most friends with Mary Wollstonecraft. Let's see, how do I say that?
Wollstonecraft.
Yeah, Wollstonecraft.
Mary Wollstonecraft.
So she probably would. So this individual probably would have been friends with Mary Wollstonecraft. She's an acquaintance with the Freedom Mob and close relative of Carmen Sandiego. Ladies and gentlemen, Angela Metzger. Angie, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, and I love your flair for the intros, but I was listening to one of them, and when David's like, I never know how to answer these, I often feel the same way, but I have to say, that's a badge of honor when people say that.
Thank you. Yes, I take it as so, and I appreciate it. I take something that's maybe a little deep, but yet a little surface level, and I bring it in. And then it kind of, people can call back to it. It's to the person how I know them. Not how I know them, of course, but it's more of a
humorous spin. I like that.
And it puts out into the universe different things. Like I put like David's like album, which will eventually happen. Absolutely. Yes. Or actually has already happened.
It is. I have seen it.
That TikTok documentary is in the pipeline.
It's in the pipeline, you know? And with all the hate mail we've been getting
that's a good
mountains.
sign.
Literal mountains
failed
of hate
assassination attempts on his life. So try harder next time. Next time, aim, guys.
Get good, scrubs.
That's right. That's why the beard keeps getting longer. It deflects the bullets.
Oh, my. So we have one heck of a show for you guys today. If you're unaware with the Snarp Fangle and what it entails, it basically encompasses one of us coming to the table of the congregation of the topic of the internets, whether it be on YouTube or wherever else you're listening to this right now. And we bring a topic to the table and we want to discuss it with everybody. And in that case, it was Angela here who brought up a discussion point. Yes. And you know what? I'm just going to pass along to her. Angie, what do you got for us to talk about today?
Well, we had talked about doing a podcast focusing on the umbrella of creativity. And I kind of came up with some questions, and I figure, like, Jake as a moderator, why don't you kind of read them? And I figure we could kind of each go around and explain our own experiences with creativity, kind of what backgrounds we come from. And I feel like sometimes when you come from different backgrounds and you talk about a subject, it's a much richer experience. Just because everybody sees it from a different perspective.
I agree.
And as 24 years as a professional educator teaching English, I can say that one perspective is boring. We need more than one.
And as a 2-year unprofessional YouTuber here, I concur.
Okay.
So let me start off with question 1, y'all. So here we go. In what way have you experienced creativity, used creativity, or enjoy creativity in your life? David, I'm going to hand it off to you. How have you really, we'll go around. We'll go around the table. And how have you expressed yourself, and how do you use it, and what joy do you get from it?
All right. Well, I guess I would say that my primary creative outlet would be music.
Okay.
And I think everything kind of connects back to that. My writing, my exploration of various other forms of media have all kind of sort of stemmed from my interest in music.
Interesting.
Okay. Like, what examples can you give me? I mean, have you written songs before? Are you part of a church worship band or something? I mean, what does that entail?
I am indeed part of a church worship band.
Oh, okay.
And I have indeed written songs. Whether they're any good, now that's a separate question entirely.
For those who aren't aware, David is our worship leader at our church.
And he is a rockin' worship leader.
He's come to
my church where I'm currently attending. Everybody's like, that was so refreshing. Yeah. And I feel like you do have that, David, and you have a gift. And it is fun to enjoy that gift, I could say, as an audience member.
We call him a guitar guru
And as a churchgoer.
here. Yeah. But I think, and we'll touch on that later about creativity and godliness and that kind of stuff. But so David, you go through music and whatnot and all that good stuff. And I'm just going to throw out there, where are you at now with that? And how's it going?
Yeah, I would like to know that too.
So that's kind of
and we know about the TikTok documentary, but
Oh,
that's,
yes.
that's a separate issue.
TikTok
That's a separate
documentary.
discussion.
I keep
It's
hearing
coming.
so much.
Don't worry.
Coming. Don't worry,
It's
guys.
coming.
It'll happen. Don't worry.
Good things come to those who
things
wait.
wait.
That's
Yes.
right. Amen.
But yeah, so right now, really, I'm just been focusing on lyricism, I think.
Interesting.
So I've always had sort of writing has kind of been a side interest of mine. And I kind of let it die post high school, but I've sort of brought it back in service of songwriting. I've become interested in honing my skills as a songwriter, and one of those things that I've been focusing on recently is the writing of the lyrics specifically.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
Okay.
That's kind of where I'm at.
It's very awesome. It reminds me in like the Greek definition of poesis. It's where we get our word poetry. That poesis was actually a special term they would bestow upon people in Greek culture because you had the power of the divine, of the gods, that you could actually create. And much of our songs and music comes from poetry. And I think that's such an interesting thing to explore because it's definitely not my gift. I couldn't carry a tune if it was in a bucket. But, I feel like I have a great appreciation for music. And when I see someone doing something in their giftings, it's like, wow, what does God have down the road? Thanks, David, for sharing. That was awesome.
David, are you going to make anything like Rammstein in the future?
Rammstein.
Oh, yes. If you didn't know, Rammstein are my number one idol.
It's Rammstein, you guys.
Man, when we said rock and worship, we said rock and worship.
I really
you
think
guys.
that there's something special to be had in worshiping God in the context of German industrial metal.
Industrial metal. We were just listening. David had Rammstein on YouTube on
Yes,
TV.
and I was
before,
like, this is stuff that was banned on
before
the
we-
radio
yeah.
when I was a kid.
Du hast and all
Du
this
hast.
kind of stuff. So
Yes.
yeah, very interesting stuff. Maybe he'll have a collaboration in the future. We'll see. Anyway, I'm going to pass it over to you, Angela. Angela, how do you use your creativity? How have you experienced it, and how do you bring joy from it?
I think like one of my things as an educator, I found out my first year of going to a university that I wanted to teach. And originally I was going to teach both social science as a single subject and English. Was going to do a double major, ended up majoring in one because I was going to a private university with a classical education. And that education was like Greek and Latin. And it was also, it was a seminary as well. So when I graduated, I ended up just choosing one major with a minor in English and a minor in biblical studies and philosophy. I don't know.
All right.
I know, but it was very interesting because you look at literature and whatnot from different ways. Graduated, got hired English teaching full time. And every time I walk away from English, it pulls me back. But I realize after 24 years of education, this last year was the last year I taught. And I've been teaching since 98 and I stopped in 2023.
Oh, wow. Oh my God.
And every year I would teach and, watching students try to be creative and at least teaching writing, I think is one of the hardest things to teach because it has both a right and a left brain function. So you're both being logical and rational, but also using your creative input. And neurolinguists have studied writing and they have no idea what happens in that moment when a student has thoughts and transverses them on paper. We have a lot of theories, we have a lot of things that go behind that, but even people in the higher echelons of academia can't answer that question. How do you write well? And so what ends up happening, at least in education and academia, people have a lot of approaches to that. And as a teacher, I'm always constantly like trying to get people like, okay, where's your creative outlet? And here's your forced deadline that you have to write the paper by, and it is kind of one of those things where you're trying to force them to be creative, but it's also that we all have a different method of being creative.
Yeah.
And writing doesn't come easy to some people. It comes easier to others. So as a teacher, I was always trying to facilitate that, but then I was also a really intensive tutor. I did a lot of tutoring, and a lot of people tutor first and teach later. I taught for 10 years and then tutored. So I don't know what that means, but it was an interesting experience. And it was interesting too, because when I started tutoring, they're like, you are not allowed to say the word proofread. I said, oh, really? What? They said, proofread is damaging to the egos of students.
Oh, God.
And I'm like, did someone just have a grammar Nazi teacher? And this is their reaction?
You cannot use
So then I said, well, what are we supposed to say? Edit when we edit their work? No. Editing is something you do for money. And I said, well, you are paying me to tutor these students through the state school board. So I don't really understand. No, we say corrections. And that was the proper academic term. And when I taught in Clear Lake, California, over 35% of the population has either been in prison or lives with someone who has been in prison. So corrections had a whole nother meaning. That was not academic. Let's put it that way.
Oh boy.
Yeah. But I will say that it was just interesting because I feel like writing, no one is a bad writer. Writing is like a musical instrument. It takes practice. And the more you practice, the better you get. And so I really would take this kind of weird approach to writing, and I would try to engage the students and just kind of facilitate that creativity. Right now I'm helping a friend and a cousin edit a book series that she's doing. And we've been content editing, and it's expanded. And there's just a lot of joy in that to help someone with their creative outlet.
You're fleshing out their work, and you're having them go through it mentally.
Yeah.
Like rearrange stuff, I'm going to imagine. And just all this kind of stuff that has to do with editing the content.
Well, and I also feel like you have to pick something that you like. The classes that I always was most miserable in as a writer were the ones where they chose the subject for me. Oh, yeah. And I've often found in my many years of teaching, if you just let people choose this topic they want and they research it, you really cut down on plagiarism too, because they've already invested in this topic.
Yeah.
And I also would have them the first day we do a workshop, I'd be like, okay, you got to let me look at it, the first paper. And they'd be like, no, this is my work.
It's not
Don't look at
yet.
this. And I'm like, you know what? I don't bite. It's okay. And just kind of going through, because if you give me a paper that's perfect, that's when I'm concerned. Because it should have mistakes. And going through that process and fixing the mistakes are how you learn. And I think just for me, at least from an education standpoint, not from an individual standpoint, there's a lot of joy in watching people work on stuff and succeed. When I worked at ISU's Writing Center, I was one of the top requested, can't say editors, I was one of the top requested tutors, and I never knew if I was going to get a comparative essay on Batman versus Superman, or if I was going to get a dissertation in psychosomatic nerve reactions and doctorate in psychology. Yeah. I never knew what I was going to get, and I didn't care.
Didn't you have a paper one time written in Klingon? Somebody wanted to write in Klingon?
No, it was
about Klingons.
It was a dissertation. It was one of the strangest experiences that I've ever had. It was a dissertation in nuclear photo diffusion, which I have no idea what the mathematical equations were. But this young man from the Ukraine, this was 2010, brought in his dissertation, and he had this thick Russian accent, and he would be like, this is what Sitka is equal to the epsilon in this. And I'm like, now, Piotr, does that make mathematical sense to you? He goes, yes, this makes perfect mathematical sense. And I'm like, good, now we need to put 2 commas here and a prepositional phrase to do what your committee wants. I had no idea what he was writing about, but I could look at the grammar and the syntax structure and tell where he needed some help.
Really
and one of my students later came in and said, Miss Metzger, because I always tell them, don't say Metzger. When I hear Professor Metzger, it sounds like a villain from James Bond. It sounds scary. And I said, just call me Miss Metz. That's what everybody called me in high school. Or you can call me Angela. And I still have that rule. First time I heard Dr. Metzger, I just about jumped around. I was like, that is the scariest thing. It just is a scary German name. And so I said, just call me Miss Metz.
Yeah, Professor Metzger sounds like one of Carmen Sandiego's cohorts, which you might have been at one point.
I was thinking Dr. Evil, something Dr. Evil would perhaps get. Yes. And so one of my students later came in and said, Miss Metz, it's like the Matrix. You could see the syntax structure that no one else could see, the code, and nobody else could see it. I thought, I kind of like that. But, it is. I will say English and writing, they're hard subjects, but they don't have to be boring.
Exactly. And I concur with that so much. I see so many, I work in education too, and in a tutoring center. And yeah, absolutely. There's so many boring things you have to walk through, and for people to really get their mind going, because it's a muscle. It's something that is not easy to learn.
Yeah.
And if you're in it for so long, I mean, it's something I struggle with too, like just writing and trying to find a good pace, but also just trying to find inspiration. Like it's hard. And you're really, as a tutor, like you and me have done before, you're kind of like trying to show their brain how to think it through and how to process it. I know you've taught people how to play different instruments.
Oh, and I bet it's a totally
similar different world.
Things, yet a different process.
Yeah, a totally different process. David. And especially people who like, I want to learn this. And you're like, all right, well, this is how we do it, and you give them the good old David Reed method. And it was,
I like that.
But yeah, it's difficult to do that when the person hasn't exercised that in a while.
Well, and there's a lot of emphasis, especially in education, where I want you to say what I want you to say, rather than the student's own thoughts. And
it's so tempting to steer them in a direction you want them to.
And I think it takes a lot of experience to get to the point where you're not pandactically telling them, you need to do this, instead of just saying, well, what do you want to say? I want your words to come through in this document.
Because the point of doing that and being a tutor to somebody and teaching them in the end is so that they don't come back to you in the end. Is that they learn how to do it on their own so they don't have to see you every day. I mean, I teach people how to do computer stuff, and I have to be very creative in how I say it to them. And sometimes it's just pointing and having them click on something, but it's also phrasing and finding simpler ways for them to understand it, or different ways if they don't get this and they can't see numbers, then I'll point to colors or something, as an example.
Yeah,
it's a game.
We all learn differently. We all process things differently. And it was always interesting to have someone come in and say like, oh, I'm working on this. And to basically say, well, this is what your teacher says, and this is what you've got. What can we do in a half an hour?
Yeah.
Because you only have so much time with students. And that was always very interesting. It was also interesting when I started working there because people would come in like, well, I am the expert on this. And these students are coming to me and I'm like, it's not about you. This is a service. You're offering a service that will guide them and hopefully help them succeed.
I know that teaching brings you much joy, and you're kind of doing a similar thing with the content editing. Are you finding that same joy in that?
I find joy in helping people get their thoughts on paper, regardless, because I really think if you teach something, writing is one of the hardest, most intensive things to teach. And I taught intensive English. I taught students English. They were learning a new language. And that was intensive because our semesters were 4 weeks. You would test everybody on Monday, start a new semester. You didn't know who you were teaching or what classes you were teaching until the hour before. You'd start teaching, and then you'd go for 3.5 weeks. On the Wednesday of the 4th week, you'd take all your tests. You grade everything on Thursday. They graduate on Friday, and the next Monday you did it over again.
Wow.
Yeah, it was intensive. And I have to say, I had to up my game with international students. 90% of my students were from the Middle East, and I came to love them. And over in the many Middle Eastern countries, not all, but most, and most of our students were from Saudi Arabia and Yemen, they have segregated education. So one time,
a huge culture shock.
It's a huge thing. Like
the
women are terrified because they've never had to speak in front of the guys since they were 8 years old. And that was always very interesting. I said, well, you got to do it. If you go to university, you're going to have to do these things. And I think one of the most interesting, I had two very distinct experiences with teaching, people from an Islamic background and Muslim students. Some of them were very, very strict. And I remember one time teaching this class of all Muslim women, and they were the Sunnis. So they were very, very orthodox, very strict. And they had face covers. The only thing you could see were their hands and their eyes. And when they realized it was a class of all women and I was the one who was going to teach them, their veils came off and they're like, look at this teacher. And they covered themselves up and then they stuck out their tongue and they're like, you can stick your tongue at people. And they don't even know that you're doing it under the veil.
That's really funny. You can do this under the veil and nobody notices.
I was not prepared for that today when I got up to teach grammar. And I will say on that, another experience on the other side of the spectrum is I taught a college class that same semester in the evening, and it was all Muslim men from Yemen and Saudi Arabia. And for over half the class, it was the first time they had a woman speak in front of them in public. But I never had a problem. I always was very respectful, and they were very respectful back.
Yeah.
And, I think part of going into stuff, whether it's your job or situations that are kind of like, well, this is going to be different, just going in with God's love loving people and that makes such a difference. And it was very interesting too, because many of the Muslim students I had said, "Oh, so you believe in God?" And I was like, "Yeah." And they didn't care that I was a Christian because from their perspective, when they look at our media, they think everybody in America is an atheist. And when they find someone, even if someone who's Jewish, they're like, "Oh, they believe in God." Like that's better, because if you're an atheist in Islam, like there's no mercy. And it was a very interesting thing. But life is an adventure. And you got to go forward with it.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll kind of go into mind stuff too at this point, because for me, I also work in a training center, and I help people out, and mostly with computer stuff or signing up for classes or getting things organized with them or data entries, some more boring things alongside. But throughout the years, I found out more and more of how to, and that's exactly what I wanted to say, is that what I agree with you with, Ange, is that it's God's love that you need to show them, because first off, you don't know what kind of day people are having. If you're just looking at it, don't know what they're going through.
Or their background.
Yeah. And, you can always make assumptions about different people, but they're usually never correct the first time around at all.
So true.
And that's part of how I've used my creativity just in my job. And I think that, specifically in like careers, it has I would say prosper in that way. It sounds like it has in yours. It sounds like David as well.
Yeah.
And it's part of showing God's love, but also in terms of the tech side of things, it's also trying to figure out problems. And some problems are unexplainable, and you can't explain it to people, or you say, well, it's just what the computer does, or there's a glitch in the system, there's a glitch in the matrix, So there's,
I like that.
You can see the matrix when you're writing.
In the matrix.
I have to find the blemishes and say, I can't explain that.
Yeah. I have something to go off of that. I'm just curious, in your own experiences, if you've had a point where you were facing a problem, and I've had this happen in my own life, and just ask, like, God, show me how to explain this to someone, or show me what to do.
Yeah.
And he shows up, and sometimes he'll just give your brain like some info. Have you guys ever experienced that? I am curious.
Yeah. David, how about you? Has God ever shown you that kind of thing? If you need to think about it, I can go first if you want.
Just like a nudge.
Why don't you go first?
Okay, cool.
It's kind of a weird question, but it is something I'm interested in hearing your experience in that.
Yeah, well, I think that it calls back to kind of our conversation we had with Thad about division and all that kind of stuff, where if you lack something, ask for it from the Lord.
Knowledge.
And knowledge, like if you lack knowledge, ask for it, and he will give it to you. And, all within reason, all within his plan, and of those he loves. But again, it's like we kind of had the conversation about going into confrontations and not knowing how it's going to go, but you ask the Lord, like, hey, you submit it to him. It's part of, I think, submission to him, and saying, hey, Lord, this is what I'm going through. I mean, he already knows it, but you just want to say it. You're like, hey, Lord, this is what I'm going through. This is what I'm dealing with. This is the problems I'm encountering, and this is what I have to achieve. I want to give it to you, and I want to give it to your hands, because you are the controller of my life, not me.
And he's the source of all knowledge when you think about it.
That's right, yeah.
I
mean, he is our creator. He knows us better than anybody. And I think that's part. But what was the other part of your question? It was...
it was just, have you ever had an instance where you're like, Lord, help me explain this to someone? Okay,
so I'm going to call back to... I'll say something else and kind of present my side of things with that, but also... in confrontation specifically, that's where my mind goes immediately.
No, it's okay. Because I'm like, that could be your experience.
No. Well, that's my experience. Like, I had to go into a situation where I'm like going to tell something and announce something to a group of people, and they happen to be my friends. We all happen to be part of the church, and there's I had to announce what I was going to say, but also kind of handle different perspectives along with those perspectives. They were influenced by, I would say, just different familiar spirits, I would describe it as. And it's interesting having to navigate around that, because it's something that I'm not used to. I don't live with that kind of thing, but that's what's influencing their opinion. Yeah. And so for me as a Christian, I have to be like, okay, Lord, I need your help. And maybe my assumption's wrong. I don't know the full details of them, but from what I'm getting, this is rubbing a cat backwards, and I'm uncomfortable. So Lord, how do I explain this in a way that won't offend them, that will get the point across, but also be honest and genuine? Because I want to communicate to them the thing about what I have to communicate across.
I guess my question, if I had to rephrase it, maybe I didn't phrase it very well, but maybe
that's one example.
Has God ever given you spiritual insight to handle something in like a non-spiritual environment or something that doesn't really call for spirituality, and yet God gives you that kind of oomph or that nudge that knowledge?
Yeah, and that's my second example actually, because when I do little video edits as well on the side, not just for the podcast side of things, but I also it was October 2022 and then December 2023, I did one edit a month, where I just make little montages on YouTube.
Yeah.
And if you want to look me up, I'm Rob the Butcher on YouTube out there.
Which is an awesome handle.
And and I just grab different movies, different movie rips that I had, different video games and whatnot. And I just kind of, put music to them. And it was really passionate. It's very something you're not going to make money on, but it's just to test your editing skills. And I did that for like a year. And I remember there was certain times, especially in my edit with it was The Raid. You know that movie, The Raid?
Yes.
I wish, David, we need to watch it. It's really good. It's like a very violent John Wick style Korean action film. And it's really bloody and awesome and it's great. And when I was doing that, I was like, how do I do this in Adobe Premiere? Because what I need is in a different editing program, but I'm going to stick with Premiere for this one.
Interesting.
And I was like trying to figure out what I do. So I was like, and this happens a lot when I was editing, I would pray and I'm like, all right, Lord, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I need your help. So help me figure this out. And so I would figure out, and kind of through that, as I'm going through the edit, I'm kind of getting inspiration at different points. And he's really I would put it on him that he's helping me through it. And I figured out how to layer a certain thing. And my edits aren't amazing, but I was really proud of it. And it was cool that God cared about my little itty bitty edits that get 10 views on
details.
YouTube. He cares about
I always remember Joanne Barry saying that. He cares about the details. And it was like, that has stayed with me for years.
Yeah, but I guess that's the only thing that I have the only example I have here. But David, what example do you have?
So as far as doing things in a non-spiritual context, it's pretty hard for me to say that specifically because I kind of view everything as spiritual.
Yeah.
So whether it be work or music or ministry, I kind of view everything as spiritual.
Yeah.
But I guess I can say that I have definitely asked the Lord for insight in trying to explain spiritual things in a context to an audience that aren't necessarily familiar with the spiritual terms, so to speak. I work at a casino, so
it's a different world, huh?
Very different environment.
Straight to the lion's den.
Yeah, very different, very spiritually dark place.
Yes.
Place where people, you got to speak to them in a way. If you're trying to explain spiritual concepts to them in the same way that you would explain it to someone in the church, you're not going to get very far, just because the language is not going to translate. So I've definitely had to rely on the Lord for that. And I've also just got back into doing youth ministry after not doing it for a while.
Wow.
Because I've had to fill a hole in the youth leadership in our church. And just recently, I was slated for doing the Devo, and I was like, okay, what do you want me to talk about? And it seemed like the Lord was saying, talk about the Bible in general.
Interesting.
Which is a difficult topic.
It is.
It seems like it's not a difficult topic, but it is a difficult topic. And I was like, how am I supposed to talk about the Bible to a bunch of teenagers who have less than a fraction of the theological underpinning that I do? Yeah.
Also attention span as well.
Attention, I was thinking that. Attention of the younger generation is.
And so I totally had to rely on the Lord for how I'm just going to present this in general. And, it's kind of a trust thing because I don't know necessarily if my approach panned out or if it didn't, but I'm hoping that it did because it led me into some really unorthodox sort of presentation techniques.
Interesting.
Like I said the word ass in a youth group.
And can you please explain?
That is in the Bible.
Can you explain the setup of that for a second, David?
I was thinking of Balaam's donkey.
So what I was trying to do was, so the concept of the Bible being the Word of God is kind of an elementary concept to someone who's been in church for a while, but it's not necessarily an elementary concept to someone who has not been in church for a while.
Yeah.
So I was trying to sort of provide sort of an example of what might happen if you approach the Bible in sort of a cavalier way, you know, because like the Bible was written for us, but it was not written to us. Yeah. And so there's a lot of contextual information that can be lost when you're just open up your Bible and flip to a random scripture. And so I was kind of trying to illustrate the
dangers of doing that.
The dangers of approaching the Bible in a non-intentional way. Well,
and I also think it's so important, like what you said. It's like you want to make sure they understand God's word because that's where his truth is. That's where his promises are. You know, if any man lacks wisdom, pray.
Yeah, I was just reading Galatians this morning, and I was just listening to it as...
Sorry, we have some squeaky chairs. It's okay.
Keep squeaking.
We're doing it.
Anyway, but I was listening to Galatians, and I was like, I was listening to it. I was, getting my morning going, and I was like, dang, this guy Paul's going so hard. He's like giving it the business, and he's talking about like Barnabas, and he's talking about how he had to correct Peter, and I'm like, holy cow, this is just blowing my mind right now. Like this is just like he's giving it to them, like the boldness to say that, and he's a guy that came into the church and started doing that, but he wasn't a part of it before, like when it started, like Peter was, or Thomas, or any of these people. But it's cool to see like that kind of scripture is just so raw to me.
Well, and his passion.
His passion
for God's word, and that he knew Christ, even though he wasn't part of that group that walked with him and talked with him, and he persecuted them. And yet that's how great God's love is. Yeah. That you can persecute him and yet be welcome into the family.
And just the image of he's walking along the desert, or he's on the camel or whatever, walking along the desert with his crew. And then like, boom, the light, everybody closes their eyes, and like God speaks to him. And he like, everybody's like, oh man, I can't, it's hard to see. Like, are you okay, Paul? And he's like, help me, or Saul. And he's at the time, and they're like, he's like, help me. They're like, what are you talking about? He's like, I can't see. And it's like, oh my God. And then like, do you remember the person he had to help him and heal him with his eyes?
Yeah. He goes and
was it Nicodemus, or what's the guy's name?
I can't remember right off the top of my head, but it's a fascinating story when you go through Acts.
So good.
And you see that. And
we won't get it all through all today. But,
but I think what's interesting about that is it's kind of going back to that idea of God giving you wisdom or giving you guidance. And I think sometimes Christians really struggle with that. Like, how do I know what God wants me to do? How do I know what God wants me to do in my life? And I remember when I started college, I prayed for wisdom, and I said, God, give me wisdom. And I was thinking wisdom for the season, but God is so good, it's wisdom for a lifetime. And then when I went into education, I really started to see things like that pop up. And like you were saying, like sometimes you don't know, David, if what you're doing got through to the audience you're teaching. And I remember being in Chico State, and they had me teaching in one of these like amphitheaters where you're like down in the pit, like an orchestra pit. And it was, I think 75% of the class that were taking this English class were business majors, so they'd come in suits. And I would be in this orchestra pit surrounded by predominantly men in suits. And they were really having trouble analyzing this literature we were reading. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to take in, I was like, get something simple. And I grabbed The Giving Tree by Shel Silverstein. And I took it into this Chico State class. And I said, so now I want you to list the things that are in here. We have branches, we have apples, they're metaphors. I want you to tell me what they are. So I start reading the giving tree. And the tree was happy. And as I'm reading, it's a dark amphitheater. And I can hear this, like these whispering. And I'm like, I don't know what's going on. Maybe somebody has to run outside for a call. I'm going to keep going. And the tree was happy. And of course, you get to the end of the story, and the tree is a metaphor for a mother's love that gives and gives and gives until there's nothing left. And then
you were talking about the giving tree?
The giving tree.
They were having trouble.
They were having trouble just reading short stories. So I took in a kid's book.
Okay.
And I thought, you know what, let's give this a shot. And so I look up, and the tree was happy, and I close the book, and I look up, and all of these men in suits are crying. And I was like, I don't know what just happened, but I said, okay, all right, so let's see a show of hands. Who can tell me what can we say about this story? And this one guy raises his hand and goes, he's like, and it was good.
Wow.
And I have all these adults. I mean, these are like serious. They're not like the party-going Chico State students. These guys are in suits, and they're crying. And I don't know what I did. So I turn around and I go, well, this is an instance of pathos, which is the Greek word for emotion. And we started talking about pathos. And I had a mentor there, and I said, Roger, I don't know what I did. And I said, should I have done things differently? And he goes, I'm going to think about this. I'll come back. And he was like this very old professor. He'd been there for years. He had these Coke bottle glasses. Wow. He comes back and he goes, I know what you did. What you did was swayed them with rhetoric. You have great power, Angela, and you have to use it for the greatest good. And I'm like, so I'm Spider-Man, apparently.
Yeah, exactly.
Teaching English to business majors.
Wow.
But it was funny because that experience kind of showed me, like, sometimes you don't know if you're getting through. And I ran into a student when I went back after I was doing my PhD, and he said, that class stayed with me. Whether we were doing short stories, whether we were doing Shakespeare, like the things I learned in that class shaped the way I viewed things. And sometimes, like David, when you're like, I don't know if it got through to them, sometimes you never know the effect you're having on people. But I would say sometimes just keep going. And sometimes if something doesn't work, that's okay. Do something different.
Yeah, and that's part of I would say being a preacher or having sermons and talking to a group of people, whether it be in church or outside of church. But it's part of it because, wherever we feel like we flubbed, that's part of, it's actually part of submission to the Lord and being like, Lord, like whatever I've done or I did my best, and the rest is in your hands. And that's really all you can do. And because there's many a time where I've had to, because I was a youth minister too. I was a youth minister for 8 years in our church. And it was, interesting because you would say things to kids or figure out, and I was, a young adult. I was like 18, 19 when I started. So it was like, I'm still figuring out life. I don't know anything. So I guess I'll be the best I can to these kids. But it's part of like, all right, Lord, whatever I've, helped out in youth group tonight or whatever I said to these kids, like just give them the right, just, I give it to you, Lord, this whole situation. Cause I'm like, I don't know if I did really good at it,
Well, and I think isn't that kind of part of using the kingdom principles that Jesus gave us is if you want to be the best, be the least. If you want to lead, serve.
Exactly.
If you want to be great, be humble. Spirituality, at least in your walk, is often the opposite of the way the world looks at it. And I feel like sometimes you get to this point where it's like, it's not about me. And once you realize it's about other people and loving others the way God sees them, it's a very different perspective, but you don't do that overnight. It's a process, just like you don't become a great educator or a great tutor overnight. That takes time. And I have to say, sometimes when you're challenged or in a situation where you're like, this is not my forte, I don't know what this is going to be like. I think teaching international students really taught me to up my game. Like just talking about asking God for wisdom. I remember going into school and like I'd be in the middle of a class and this student raises his hand and goes, so why when I go to another state teacher, do I have to take a driver's license in another state? And I would be like, well, we're supposed to talk about conjunctions today, but okay, we can digress for 8 minutes. And I'd basically have to explain, this goes back to the Civil War. Who has the rights? The state versus the federal government. Because you go to that state has a right to give you a driver's license test. And it was just interesting. I one time, I think the weirdest experience I had was the Buddhist students from Thailand that were in this group. And they said, teacher, I read this essay. Where is the center of the universe? And I'm like, what? It was a short story. What are you talking about? And they're like, center of the universe, teacher. I read this essay and I need to know where the center of the universe is. And I'm like, did I miss something? What did they read? I'm looking at the paper. I'm like, okay, this is a short story about a man who goes into a store. I don't know why you're looking for the center of the universe. And so then afterwards, I talked to them and I'm like, oh, do you mean you're looking for the main part of it, but you're calling like the argument the center? And they're like, yes, in the Asian world, everything is trying a circle, always trying to find the middle of the circle. And I said, oh, well, you have to realize we think of time linearly. We don't think of it as a circle. So that's why everything in the West is a line, intro, body, conclusion, beginning, middle, end. And I said, you have to think about it linearly, guys. And so, it was just sometimes a cultural thing, or they came at education from a different point of view. But I found myself like every day just asking God for wisdom. I'm like, God, help me explain this. I remember trying to explain it to this one student, and he was a chemical engineer, and the oil company was paying for him his education. Brilliant man. Had like a PhD, and they're sending him to school to learn English. And I remember trying to explain something to him like 8 different ways. And finally I looked at him and I said, Saeed, what if you look at English like a hallway? When you open this door, this is the prepositions. When you open this door, these are the action words. Yeah. And we started going through it and it just clicked for him. Good. And I feel like sometimes, even something as simple as that, you're helping someone comprehend, you're giving those the tools they're going to need in the future. And I feel like there's a great sense of creativity that goes into us interacting with other people. And I think one of the most things that I've learned that's really impacted my life is to realize that those creative innovations are God-given, and that you can ask God to guide your actions or guide your thoughts or, help me explain this to this person. And, there's just been times he showed up. And I feel like that never happens overnight. That part is also a process where they say it's never the destination, it's the journey to get there. And as Christians, I think that's kind of how our walks are, whether it's something we deal with in our professional lives or something we deal with in our personal lives. All of that is leaning on him for inspiration and guidance.
Yeah, and I would say that, we've already given examples of like asking God for this, asking God for that, but also to be careful in obedience as well. And what you create and intentionality in what you want to create.
Very true.
Because, I kind of want to ask you guys, what is your definition of art as a Christian? And I want to see what you guys say, because I think I'll just go for me first, because for me, the definition of that is, I don't really have a great example, but I would say something that strives to give you, I would guess good morals is what I would say. But okay. I would also...
Would it be something that enriches your life, perhaps?
I would think so, but I'm trying to think of examples of that, but I'm not really, I'm thinking more of the media kind of side of things.
Like art from a Christian perspective kind of a thing?
Yes.
Okay.
I would say.
Okay. Yeah. The way I would kind of define art from a Christian perspective is, to me, it seems like the idea of using your God-given gifts and talents in a way to move other people. Because, that's what all art seeks to do, right?
Yeah.
Is to move someone.
I like that.
Whether it be intellectually or emotionally.
Yes.
And as a believer, the idea, I think, is that you're narrowing in on the things that God has gifted you in and using that to move others into a place where they can be closer to him, or they can be receptive to what he's trying to do in their life.
Yeah. Well, I love that because, a classical definition of art, and I think throughout most of history until we get to the 20th century, the point of art was to draw you closer to the heavens. And I think we've really strayed very far from that.
Yeah.
It's
strayed more inward than anything.
I do, but I also think part of that is the postmodern age.
Yeah.
Once the atomic, people always say, the modern age was the first part of the 20th century. And then once you get to World War II and the atom bomb drops, the game changes. Because once man has control of the atom, people were like, where are we going? And they always call that the postmodern age. And it's almost like society fractures into all these different, things that people are interested in. This can be art and that can be art. And what's interesting is if you study art before the 20th century, Puritans did not like art. They thought all art was sinful because of the nudity that came in. And a lot of that came from the Greek world, because the Greeks believe if you had something in nature, nudity was the perfect form. But also when you get into the Renaissance, that's why you have the Sistine Chapel. You have people doing sculptures and paintings and commemorating all these things. Is because the point of art was to draw you to God's creativity, to draw you to the Creator, to draw you. It was supposed to be something holy to elevate you and to draw you above your drudgery and your life and to look to the heavens, to the Creator. Now, we've really changed, I think. And I think the church has always had a very contentious relationship with art, especially in the last 200 years. I think the Puritans kind of kicked art out of the church in the 1600s. And I always remember a pastor in Asia, I think it was South Korea, saying in the Truth Project, he said, the church may have given up on art, but God never has. God is the God of creativity. He wants people to use their gifts. And I think for me, looking at art, I would say it's twofold. Yes, I do believe it elevates you. It can bring you higher. It can get you out of your funk. Like you're having a really bad day, you listen to the Beatles, life is better. Yeah. I remember one student, because the Beatles were outlawed in Saudi Arabia, most Western music was. He came over, and in the first 3 months of living in America, he spent $500 on iTunes and got all this music that was banned. And he said, I'm taking it back with me. And I'm going to hide it in flash drives and stuff. And I mean, he had all these ways when he went through security, they were not going to take his music from him. And I thought, that is so beautiful, because sometimes you're having a bad day and there's something healing about humor or music or watching a skit or something. Art is meant to help us get through our life. And I feel like it can be divine. It can come from God. It also cannot come from God. So I think you have to have discernment there. But I also believe that
just go watch a Rammstein.
I would like to say something.
Oh, go ahead.
Those
Sorry,
lines.
David, if I'm talking too much.
That the scripture says that the gifts of God are without repentance. So God gives gifts as he wills, according to the scripture. And I believe that includes the creative gifts.
Yes.
So he gives gifts as he wills, and then we make use of those gifts however we will. And sometimes we make use of those gifts in a way that are not in line with his will.
Very true. I agree with that.
And I think it's interesting you say that, David, and I think that it's interesting hearing the story of that guy, like literally like putting things on flash drives, sneaking them
trying to take the Beatles with him.
It's, what's the natural, I think, conclusion to this kind of talk we're having? And it sounds like for people to,
I think
thinking about it. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Can I say something while you're mulling it over?
Go for it.
I also believe it's important just to say that just because one person says this is art does not mean that it's art. Just because it's that one person's art doesn't mean it's everybody's art. I mean, I had to teach literature, and some of the postmodern literature is the most depressive stuff you have ever read. There's no hope. Everybody is just miserable. Yeah. Everybody's dead by the end of the story. Yeah. And I got to this point this last year teaching literature again, because they'd give me the lit class, which everybody wanted. And I thought, you know what? I'm not teaching depressing literature. I taught The Hobbit. We read The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. Oh, yeah. And we watched that in conjunction with the movie, and it was hopeful. And we ended with like some stuff that just gave you hope. And I said, this is an analytical class, but the point of this class is for you to leave and think for yourself. And I feel like just because somebody, like, let's say you have someone who loves Korean soap operas, and that's their art. I don't think that's bad. I feel like we all are made different. We all have different art we are attracted to. For some people, it's Stranger Things. Maybe Stranger Things is too graphic for this person that likes maybe sweet Amish romance. And I'm like, everybody.
My favorite.
Everybody. But basically, like, everybody has different interests. And I feel like we're at a point in time when we have all these platforms, all this access to different kinds of art. And just because it's not your art doesn't mean it's not everybody's art. You know what I mean? It doesn't mean it's not good. And it doesn't elevate you, or it doesn't draw you to God, or it doesn't get you through the day.
Well, I think it's interesting how, because I was doing some research on Thomas Paine this week, which is fascinating. Like, if you
He's
look at
a fascinating
his life,
writer too.
and like, he started in England, goes over to America, does his whole spiel there, writes Common Sense, writes all these things that heavily influence the direction of this country.
Revolution and the French.
And then he goes over to France, and his whole rigmarole. I think it's honestly God protecting him in a lot of ways when you look at his life. Like, for those who aren't aware, when he was in France during the Revolution and he was writing stuff about it, he was fighting against different French, I don't know how to describe it, influencers, generals, people who had a lot of influence in France.
It was probably people who were either of the aristocracy or the intellectual elite.
Yeah, he was calling them out. He was writing different things.
Like, you're a hypocrite.
This is an age where, you mentioned that we have all these platforms. He had the pen and the paper. That's all they had back in the day. I mean, I think he probably would have created, like, I don't know, movies or podcasts or something back in the day, or to get his word out there. But he had the pen and the paper, so that's what he would do. And he would write. And it was like Rights of Man came out of that guy, and it just, it's amazing to do research. But the thing I wanted to bring up with that is he didn't stop doing it.
Yes.
He didn't stop going for the truth. Even when Ben Franklin confronted him and he said, I only want to live in a country, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something like, I only want to live in a country where there's liberty. And the guy said, no, I want to live in every country, even if there is no liberty, because I want to fight for that. And I want to make sure that that's what's left. And it was beautiful because there's a point where he's going to be executed in France.
Oh my God.
And the guys who wrote, they go through the prison, he was in prison, and they go through the prison and write on the door of if you're either going to get executed or not, like the symbol or the phrase or whatever, like, hey, they marked it so that they would get them in the morning to take out to the gallows or to the beheading or whatever. And they wrote on his door, but for some reason they only wrote on the inside of the door and not the outside of the door. So they're like, it's fine. And they keep going. And then the next morning when they go and get all the people who are ready to be executed, they pass him by because the symbol was written on the inside of the door. You're like, what? What? You can't even write this. It's totally, I think, an intervention.
It's too much to be a coincidence.
It's too much to be a coincidence. I think God definitely intervened and kept him going and brought him back to America and gave him people who took care of him the rest of his life.
Wow.
And until the point of he passing away. And he didn't buy anything. He donated all of his money to the Continental Army.
Wow.
And the whole process. But
he was all in.
He was all in. And I just think I would bring him up just as a reason because he's an example of somebody who really just utilized their talent and kept doing it for like what you were saying, like the betterment of everybody and well, and also liberty and God.
Living in that time period, things cost you.
Yeah.
It cost you.
Yeah. And when he was going to be executed in France, George Washington didn't write back to him. John Adams didn't write back to him. Thomas Jefferson, I think, was the only guy that tried to help him out in some form. And it was crazy because those were people that he heavily influenced and were friends with. And they didn't help him out except for like one or two.
They didn't show up.
But
isn't it interesting? His life was spared.
And his life was spared.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like there's something.
So there's a cost to
There's
arts.
a cost to that. And I also think it's also that medium of writing is so powerful. I mean, I think we've seen that nowadays. Like they always say, what is mightier, the pen or the sword? And I think words can start revolutions. They're way more deadly than bombs and sometimes guns in some ways because it is. And I feel like there's something powerful about writing and ideas that sway people. And one of the things I would always find with students is they're like, what should I write about? And I said, well, that's up to you. The whole point of this class is for you to think and you to discover what kind of writer you are. And I've had people pick an argument, pick a side, they were like, I'm totally for them bending the knee. And halfway through the argument, they change their argument because you have to talk about both sides. And I said, whenever you have an argument, there's a pro and a con, a right and a wrong, a yes and a no. And I said, the interesting thing is none of us are all the way pro or all the way con. Most of us fall somewhere in between. We say there are these two choices because that's how our brain operates. It's easier to understand binaries, this and that. But really, in argument, there's 45 different arguments. You're not just going to have one. And I said, sometimes I'll mess with them a little and I'll be like, well, what if there is no right argument? What if there is no argument? What if they're both wrong? They're like, you can't say that. I said, yes, you can. That's how life is. And sometimes both of the arguments have their merit and they're right. And I said, that's part of you thinking and working your way through that process. And it's my job just to facilitate that. And I always remember this one professor having us come in. And I have to say, in the last 15 years of being in higher education, it's so nice to see some of the walls come down. Like if you were doing any research on anything in popular culture, people would sneer at you. Like I remember doing this one graduate paper about Harry Potter as a messianic figure, that he was basically a Messiah-like figure and he laid down his life and that's what broke the evil in the book. And people are like, well, when you're done with that popular culture, maybe you can come back to reading real literature. And what has happened since Facebook and all these social medias have emerged after, I'd say 2008, 2010, the game in academia changed. I mean, it can be a very cutthroat world. People, I one time was really waiting late tutoring the student in a basement of this one building. And I wrote a poem about academia being like the professors are zombies looking for ideas to consume. They're looking for brains to eat. And that is very much a metaphor. Like if somebody gets an idea, they will steal it and take it from you to get ahead. And there's sometimes I'm like, go ahead, take that idea. I'm never going to use it, but it was very interesting because the game just changed. Like I found an article last year about Wittgenstein's theories in Pokemon characters. And somebody was publishing this in a journal of higher education. Wow. And I'm like, oh my gosh, the game has
I don't
changed.
know whether to describe that as the fall of higher education or the incorporation
I think it's a desperate
culture.
people, because when you get to the PhD level, it's kind of that idea of the ivory tower. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
Oh, yeah.
The ivory tower is like with each level of education, you are building this tower until you get to the very top. Let's say you do your PhD and you get done with it. And you are an expert on this one thing. For instance, when somebody does their master's, you can do 50, 70 pages on a broad category. For instance, when I did my master's at Chico State, I looked at the mythos of the American dream in 20th century American literature. I was like, I wanted to look at like that genre and research it. But then when I did my PhD, I thought, this one guy I went to school with, I swear, he did 350 pages on dwarven swords in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that is a fascinating topic, but I actually want those 300 pages to be something that people will use and not just shelved away. And you know what? If that's your thing and you want to research it, go for it. More power to you. Yet again,
there's a time and a place. Yeah, there's time and place for all of it.
But for me, I wanted something that was a little more applicable. So I ended up going into education and looking at this subject that often terrified people called institutional critique, where it was ways to look at academic departments and how to improve them. And people were terrified of that.
That sounds really scary.
And I had some instances where people kind of set me up to fail, and then I came through with an answer. And they were like, oh my gosh. And I ended up making it a chapter of my dissertation. But it was one of those things that's like, I want whatever I'm writing. If I'm going to do this big work, I want it to actually make a difference. And I think that's just part of my personality and stuff.
And speaking of making a difference, we're getting to the end here. So I want to bring the last question here to you all. And the question is, what are some things in our lives that have really resonated with us as creative individuals, and what has influenced us? But something that just really resonates with you. And Angie, what is
like something examples? In art or creativity?
In something in pop culture and art, something that really, it could be music, movie, film, it could be a TV show, it could be writing.
Okay, if I had to take that on, I would say it's something narratively that tells a story that just captures my imagination or has an argument that I'm like, yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And there's something in that argument that I agree with, either as a Christian or an individual. But I think like there's certain stories sometimes that come along and you're just like, that resonates with me so strongly. And I can't really tell you why sometimes until I've mulled it over. It's very hard for me to read and get sucked into a story anymore just because I'm so used to analyzing it as an academic.
Yeah.
But when I can watch a story and there's something about that story where it either speaks God's truth or there's this message of like, unconditional love. And I'm just like, that touches my heart. And I just off the top of my head, The Last of Us pops in my mind. The adaptation of that story. I remember watching the game playthrough, and just kind of being shocked at the way love was portrayed, that love is kind of this thing that all of us elevate towards, and that love is strong. People will do crazy things for love, both as a parent and as an individual. But at the same time, when you get to the end of that arc in the second game, and all there is the love of that father for the daughter, and that pulls her back. There's just something beautiful, whether you love that, whether you hate that. There's just sometimes, I think when something resonates narratively, because we are wired narratively for story, that's something that's just like, oh, I can't stop thinking about it. Or I watch it again, and every time I watch it, I get something different out of it. That's something that really is just something that makes me passionate about things. Because I'm like, oh, I love this argument. This argument is so good, because everything has an argument. Some things have more than one. But I always tell students, when you look at something, we watched The Twilight Zone not too long ago. What is the argument he's trying to get across? And it's amazing how timeless those episodes are.
Oh, man.
And the students are like, I don't know if I could watch a black and white. I've never seen anything in black and white. I was like, well, if you want to get credit for today's exercise, you will. But it's very interesting to watch their experience change or watch them think for themselves. Things Rod Sterling said about technology and human nature. I don't know, stuff like that fascinates me.
Yeah. David, what art really resonates with you, and any specific examples in your life?
Let's see.
Rammstein.
Rammstein.
Well, I mean, that's kind of a good example, actually, because I think what resonates with me the most. See, I'm a musician. I've been a musician for a long time, and I have an analytical mind when it comes to music. So a lot of things which a lot of people might enjoy or whatever, I might tend towards picking it apart. But so what really resonates with me are those things which can bypass that process entirely and move me to an emotional state.
Oh, interesting. Yes.
So it's it's kind of one of those things that happens sort of once in a blue moon for me, anymore.
Yeah, me too.
At one point, Rammstein was kind of that for me.
Really?
Yeah, they're
I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh.
No, I feel like what it is probably from a musical perspective, you're taking in things Jake and I don't see. And you're probably noticing like, wow, that was really cool. They use that technique, or they're working on different levels, And I can appreciate it, but I can't pick it apart.
I have very little experience with Rammstein. I've only seen the music videos you've been playing. And
well, to me, it's more like I think my mind reacts to different things emotionally than most people as regards to music, because most people react emotionally to songs which are basically kind of
pop songs.
Yeah, pop songs from a musical perspective
songs
aren't anything particularly different or special. And not that there's anything wrong with that.
No.
I have some guilty pleasures when it comes to pop music.
If you want to listen to industry plants, go for it. Yeah. I mean, go for it. No, I'm joking.
No, but I'm wired a little differently, I think. And so the things that appeal to most people don't really appeal to me. So Rammstein was kind of like, for a point in my life, back probably when I was just getting out of high school, they kind of appealed to me as like, because they were different than anything else.
Yeah.
They were experimental, yet still catchy.
Yeah.
They were dark and moody and weird, but yet still kind of like
honest.
Their music tapped into the same kind of like primal emotions that anyone else did.
Yeah. And I think they also, certain groups capture what the Germans would call the Zeitgeist of the age, that spirit of the age that was coined in the 1800s. That it's like there's a certain feeling at that moment in time. And I feel like that group did that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel like sometimes when it appeals to you, it's a heart versus a head thing. You don't really know why it does. It's just something it touches in your heart. And then later you're like, this art form, I understand like years later why it appealed to me, because it was pushing this, or it appealed to this, or this is a gifting or something I'm passionate about. And I feel like it's okay if you don't have those answers why it appeals to you. But at the same time, there is something about art that is eternal. There's something about art that appeals to us. And I feel like even if it's not your art, it doesn't mean you throw it away. You know, there's all kinds of art. And I think it's important to experience the things that elevate you, that get you through the day. Those are important things.
Yeah, and I think for me, in terms of what really resonates with me is, I would have to say maybe good overcoming evil, or in a dark place there is hope.
Yes.
I would probably say that really resonates with me. I mean, I'm
that's
probably going to go
interesting.
with music for this example, because when I was at work today, I was going back and listening to some Skillet albums. And I'm like, let me just listen to this and just enjoy it for what it is. And
some good stuff.
It's interesting because in the album, the one that has Rebirthing, the one that has Better Than Drugs.
One of their most famous.
Yeah, the one, I think it's 0405, if you guys remember. Anyway, but that one specifically, I remember, I was a kid when it came out, and listening to it, in a high school age when I was listening, I'm like, yeah, this stuff's good. And then listening today as an album, which, by the way, the art of the album is so far removed from today's music industry, like the art of having a disc or a vinyl and what comes after each song and how they all incorporate to each other.
An intro,
I feel like
and outro.
that before, during the iTunes boom when this album came out.
Yeah, that's true.
This album still had that. It was the mid 2000s, so it still had that core, and it's just so beautiful. And the way John Cooper organizes the lyrics and have his wife singing on that album really resonates with me. A lot of the vocals. Yeah, he's got a great voice. But I think it really resonates with me because it is, and you could see it from a secular point of view. You can see it as, oh, this is like moody, teenage angst, You
could have that interpretation.
Whispers in the dark, all that kind of stuff. You can have that interpretation, but it's so beautiful because it really comes from a point of just being so biblical and being so, I believe, anointed in a way, that album, because it talks about how your love for God it overcomes everything, and your dedication to him as well. And it just really speaks out to me. And I would highly recommend it to people, because looking at it from, now I'm an adult and looking at it from that perspective, I find stuff going back to music and going back to songs you're somewhat familiar with and seeing it not just from a different perspective, but picking out different things that really resonate with you. I find that a lot in the Relient K albums, especially in their first 5 or so. Like, I'll find something that just hits right. Yeah. And I did it in my teenage years, and it continues to do it in my 20s. I mean, and in terms of Skillet, Relient K, and also 10th Avenue North, they really hit those three things: your identity. Relient K kind of hits your kind of purpose in it. Yeah. And then the more spiritual side of things, your morality side of things, kind of hits with 10th Avenue North when you come in.
Well,
more spiritual relationship with God.
I like how you said that, the good versus evil. I one time heard a literary agent last year say all stories, when she's trying to sell them, because a literary agent's trying to take a story, try and pitch it to companies. She said all stories fit into two categories: boy meets girl, or good versus evil. And I find myself drawn to the good versus evil because I feel like that is an eternal battle. And as Christians, I think we battle against that at different seasons in our life, but that's always going on. Every day is a fight. Every day is trying to establish that God is good and not giving into the lies of the world. Yeah. I was just listening to the song Firm Foundation that Dante Bowe does with, I forget who it is, Moore. I think it's Moore. And they're doing a live performance, but there's something so powerful in those worlds that it's the truth of God is that he's sovereign and he doesn't fall off of his throne. Even when your world feels like it's falling apart, all these things go wrong, things aren't going as you're maybe going through a chaotic season, God doesn't fall off of his throne. And our job as Christians and individuals is either we resonate with that and we believe the truth that he's God and that he loves us, and that, like Jeremiah 29:11 says, he has plans for your life, or you give into the lie that God's abandoned me. You know, and I feel like that good versus evil is an everyday struggle. And I feel like there are lies that you can give into that kill your creativity, that take your creativity away.
The overanalyzation of things, the voice in the back of your mind, the imposter syndrome.
It's not good enough.
It's not good enough. So one more thing before we go. Like you said, Ange, I think imposter syndrome is the biggest, deterrent for somebody who is trying to make something creative, even if they're masters at it. And I just want to bring that up because you look at it and you must remember, and I've had it tons of times when I'm doing video edits, I'm like, God, this looks like crap. And I've stared at it and listened to the song so many times that I don't think this is good. And you're not proud of it or whatever. But I think it's important to remember what your identity is and who your identity is in.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, where your creativity
flows from.
So with that, we want to thank you all for listening to this wonderful episode of the Snarp Fangle Podcast. And we just want to thank you for taking the time to listen. And we'll see you again on another episode. And Snarp Fangle on.
All right.
Oh, thank you, Angie, again for being here.
It's all right. That sounds awesome.
Thank you,
David. Thank you.
Anyway, goodbye, everybody. Have a good one.
Bye-bye now.